Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Midland Cultural Center and welcome to A Day in the Life. Now, here is the host of A Day in the Life, Fred Hacker.
Well, good evening. What a great crowd. Thank you all for coming. You know, there is a basketball game on and a Blue Jays game. But anyway, so it's special that you're here. Thank you for being here. This is program number 130 in our series. And this is a special one. This is a very interesting guy, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But first of all, I want to thank our season sponsors. We are really pleased to be sponsored on an annual basis by the firm of Bales, Dishaw, Holloway, who are financial managers. And I'm wondering if I can ask, I think I see Michelle. Are Kathy and Jeff here? Yeah. There they are. Yeah. Thank you very much for your continuing support for the program. The firm are portfolio managers at RBC Dominion Securities, and they provide wealth management services and strategic advice to their clients. We also have show sponsors, and tonight two organizations, both of which are operated by the same people, are sponsoring us. So our sponsors tonight are A&A Services and Marine Contracting Limited, that's a mouthful, and also Remax Baywatch Real Estate in Honey Harbor. And I would like to invite Anne-Marie and Armin Grigaitis, who are our sponsors, to stand up, please. Armin, we're going to have to shorten the names of your companies.
It's your fault you incorporated them.
You didn't need to say that. But I should have anticipated it. Well, our guest tonight, we've been promoting him as a rock star, and he really is in the world of geology. But I can tell you that I've learned a lot about many, many subjects doing this program for the last decade, and this is one that I'm finding fascinating, and I hope you will too. Would you welcome our guest, Nick Eyles? Welcome, Nick. Glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, we're going to explain to our friends here a little bit about your life and about your vocation and about an application that it has in our own area here to Georgian Bay. But first of all, let me, through you, just explain to those in the audience who haven't been with us before that what we're going to be looking for are some of the insights into influences in your life. How did you get where you are today? And we'll also be using your life and your career and some of your pursuits as an inspiration for the audience. So let's begin right at the beginning. And I'm sure as soon as people hear you talk, they'll be able to guess where you're from. But tell us where you were born.
Well, I was born in London, England, more years ago than I care to remember. I think the Romans were still running around at the time. And I was surrounded by history. And I was born right on the river, and the River Thames still flows through my veins. And there was Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, there was St. Catherine's Dock, where the first convicts left for Australia, the first fleet. And there were a lot of Eyles on those ships too.
Were there?
Yeah, there's more Eyles in Australia than there is in London. And then there's the Mayflower, where the Pilgrims left from. They didn't leave from Plymouth, they left from Rotherhithe in London. And then you go further down the river and there's Deptford, where the shipbuilding started, and Peter the Great apprenticed. And then you end up at Greenwich, where Henry VIII was born, Queen Elizabeth I, her sister, and so on.
Yeah.
So I was surrounded by history, and as a kid, I didn't really appreciate it. I do now. But I just wanted to get out. I wanted to make my own history.
Let's talk a little about your parents, maybe, before you get out. Well,
yeah,
introduce us to your mother.
They were classic Cockneys. They were from the East End of London, very low income. My grandfather was a policeman. They lived in police flats, and it was a big family. They could only afford to send the eldest daughter to school. So my mother, like her siblings, left school, I think 13, 14. And she tells stories of kids having their teeth out. So they couldn't afford to go to a dentist, so it was easy to have all their teeth out, palates, you know, that sort of stuff. And then my father, too, was very humble origins. His father had fought in the First World War and been injured, and claimed to have recognized the German that threw the grenade at him in London, because there were a lot of Germans coming into London after the war for work, right? So I come from very humble beginnings, and I then got out of it by going to school. I went to grammar school, typical British grammar school. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you walk into school, there are memorials to fallen old boys. So you're left in no doubt about what your role was going to be in the world. You're either going into the military or the civil service or academia.
Now, you had an uncle who was married to your mother's sister.
Yep.
Who had you working with him. What were you doing there? This would be, I guess, while you were fairly young, was it?
Yeah, I was in mid-teenager, and I had, like everybody else, a whole succession of really horrible jobs, and I learned that I didn't like to work 9 to 5 jobs. But I had a really interesting job with an uncle, because this was the mid-60s. So there was the war going on in the Middle East, and there was a huge demand for military vehicles. So it was my job. We went up to auctions where we would buy ex-military vehicles, and we would drive them down. It was my job as a young teenager to drive them down the motorway to this big chicken farm. And there they would be resprayed, redone up, new axles, new tires, and then we'd take them back to the docks. And that was the most interesting job I ever had, I think, as a young person.
But that wasn't what you aspired to do with your own life.
No, not at all. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I just wanted to get out of London. And when I was a kid, this was the 60s and 70s, it was either through music, and Mick Jagger was at my school, Keith Richards was in the area, there was David Bowie, there was Elton John, all in the same area. So you escape from London either through music or sports. And there was no training facilities for sports. So I was quite frustrated, actually, as a young person. And I'd done a lot of reading about exploration, mountain climbing. I went to as many lectures in London as I could from people coming back from the Himalayas. And I remember doing press-ups on my mother's living room and thinking, how on earth am I going to get out of this place? And so I went to a grammar school, and I thoroughly enjoyed my school years, because there were masters there who'd been in the military. And my geography teacher was Major Williard, and he used to illustrate topography and the making of maps by reference to artillery chutes and dead ground and leading slopes and reverse slopes. It was fascinating. But there was a young guy appointed, named Richard Priestley. I remember his name, I always will. He was a geology teacher. And even though it wasn't on the curriculum, he taught a course in the evening. So we sort of volunteered, did this course. And there were 12 of us. And out of that 12, 3 of us went on to do geology, become professional geologists. And I got out of London.
That's influence.
I got out of London. We went on field trips. We did a lot of youth hustling around Britain. We went on all the classic geology sites. We got into Northern Europe. I thought, this is fantastic. This is what I want to do at last. And then I thought, well, all I want to do is teach geology in a high school like him. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I went to university. I went to the same university that he'd been to do geology. And of course, your horizons lift. And I found I was interested in research. And that was the beginning of my research career and actually putting something back into geology. But it was that teacher that really did it for me.
Now, he mentioned the name of I believe he mentioned the name of a famous geologist who later in life took on some significance for you.
Yeah, it's a funny thing actually, because I can remember the diagrams this teacher put up on the board, and they're all from this Canadian sort of esoteric name of Tuzo Wilson. And they're all about plates moving around the Earth's surface, colliding, moving apart. And I was fascinated by this stuff. And it's complete irony, I suppose, that later on, when I came to Canada, I taught, and I've been teaching now for 42 years at the same university that Tuzo Wilson was at. Yeah. And I have just finished a biography of this great geologist.
I was just going to say,
it's come full circle.
I happen to have a book here that that happens to be about the guy you're talking about.
It's well written too, actually.
It actually is.
It is, yeah.
Oh, it's written by you. That's why. That's why.
You should see the illustrations too. They're just fantastic.
You did that too. Yeah.
I had nothing to do with that.
Well, we'll catch up with Tuzo later, but you mentioned sports, and I understand you were involved with that. But you had another early life hobby in those days that you still pursue.
I did, yeah. I had two hobbies. One was at school. I was in the combined cadet force, and I was in the RAF cadets. We did a lot of flying in southern England out of World War II fighter bases, particularly Manston, Biggin Hills. We had great views of the cliffs of Dover and all that sort of stuff. And I really enjoyed that. And my job in the school was to run the armory. And we could have started World War III quite easily. It was incredible. My job was to make sure everything was spick and span, and I used to hand out Ren guns, Sten guns, 303s, and young cadets would take these down a busy school corridor and clean them, and then bring them back, and I'd inspect them and put them back on the racks. And Friday afternoons were devoted to corps, cadet corps, and in a room where an hour earlier there'd been a course on religious instruction, we'd be stripping these, various guns down. But the other thing I got into was motorcycles. And I found geology and motorcycling a perfect combination, because I could finally get out of London on my own steam. And that started me on a lifelong journey, I suppose, of using motorcycles in the field. And I go down to the American Southwest, do a lot of work down there. And I just love the solitude of being on a bike, thinking about things and looking at landscapes. And I found it's a perfect vehicle in more ways than one for doing geology research.
After you left school, you pursued higher education. Tell us where you did your first post-secondary.
Well, I went to Leicester, which is in the English Midlands, and it was the same university that the geology teacher at school had been, so I knew the program. And I was part of a cohort of about 25 students. In those days, there was no course selection. You did the degree, you read for a degree. Mm-hmm. So it was all tutorial based, a lot of essay work. And then I graduated, and I found I was interested in paleontology, the study of long dead things, fossils. And I got a job working in London at the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, perhaps the best, most well-known natural history museum, certainly in Europe. And my job there was to make perfect replicas of early hominid skulls, because the museum had a complete collection of skulls going back 2 million years or so from Africa. And people were doing research on them, but the museum didn't want to send out the originals. So I made perfect copies, and then they were sent out to the researchers. But that kind of got tiring pretty quick. So I actually quit that job. And there was a friend who was doing a PhD on a glacier in Norway. And he said, well, why don't you come out and give me a hand? I need some field assistants working on this big ice cap, big glacier. And I went out there and I fell in love with ice and fell in love with glaciers, anything to do with cold. That became my thing, as it were.
Now you did some graduate work here in Canada. How did that come about?
Well, that was a complete fluke because while I'd been at Leicester, one of the profs had said, he must have thought I was promising graduate material. Why don't you apply to Memorial University in Newfoundland? And I didn't know where it was. So I hurriedly looked it up in a book. It wasn't online.
Yeah.
And I submitted the application. I can still remember to this day getting the envelope, opening the envelope, and finding out I'd been accepted, and had the princely sum of about $3,000 to work as a teaching assistant while I did my graduate work.
Right.
And so that's how I came to Canada in 1974. And lo and behold, I got to Memorial. A very exciting time there because most of the island is made up of the remains of an ancient ocean that closed when Africa collided with North America. So there's a lot of excitement about plate tectonics and the sort of work that Tusa Wilson was developing. A lot of that was ground truthed in Newfoundland. And anyway, I met this guy who worked on glaciers, and it's hard physical work. And he'd gotten out of it, usually with bad knees. But he wanted to get back into it. And this was the 70s. And, you know, I don't know if you remember the 70s. They say if you do remember the 70s.
I do remember.
You weren't there. But the 70s climatically were the opposite of what we're going through right now. They were cool and wet.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of concern in Canada with the next ice age, which would have been a disaster. I mean, climate warming, you could argue, is a good thing for Canada. But climate cooling and renewed ice ages would be absolute disaster. They were beginning to find that you grow ice sheets. You grow these huge ice sheets from the base up. So you have a few cold summers where you preserve all the snow that fell the previous winter. And you build this thing up over huge areas from the base up. And I got money from the government to go out to British Columbia, and up near Stewart, right on the Alaska border, there's a big glacier called the Barrington Glacier. And that time the Vietnam War was still on, there was a huge demand for copper, and there was a copper mine there right by the glacier. So there was a lot of concern about where this glacier was going to grow, because all glaciers worldwide were growing in this cooler climate. And so my job as a fresh graduate student was to figure out if this thing was going to expand over the mine site or it would continue its retreat. And I still remember looking at this big mountain, big glacier coming down, thinking, how the hell am I going to do that?
Yeah.
Anyway, I did it. You drill stakes into the glacier. It's different now. You use what they call photogrammetry, where you can measure the change in elevation of the glacier and its likely future activity by LiDAR and other geophysical means. In those days, you had to drill stakes in, put these stakes in, measure how much snow was being accumulated over the winter, how much was surviving the next summer, how much melt was taking place. There was a lot of physical work. And I was lucky to survive, actually, because you run into bears. So I actually got charged by a grizzly one day and had to literally jump off a cliff to get away from this thing, and I did. But we had bear problems all summer, and we'd be on the ice, and quite commonly 2 little bear cubs, grizzly bear cubs, would come wandering across, and you think, oh Christ, where's Mum?
They're probably not alone.
So we literally drop everything and just get the hell out of there. But I got the work done, and I got a taste for working on glaciers, which I've had ever since.
During that time, you were, and this seems, I mean, geographically I can understand it, but you were traveling from Memorial University in Newfoundland to the northwest of British Columbia, just about as far as you can go in Canada, and you discovered Georgian Bay during that time. How did that happen?
Well, I was a cheap graduate student, so I'd get the bus. And I'd stop Parry Sound, North Bay, just have a break. And I found, even though I was going through the Rockies many times and I was working on this very mountainous area, that the mountains were claustrophobic. And I found Georgian Bay sort of expansive, and this sort of waterscape. I'd never seen anything like it before. And it absolutely intrigued me. And I think that's probably my lasting memory of those bus trips. And it's funny now that, you know, having lived in Toronto for more than 40 years, that a lot of my history, family history, cottaging and so on is inextricably linked with Georgian Bay. It's funny.
Well, we'll talk more about Georgian Bay for
Yeah.
sure. I do want to ask you, though, whether when you were at Memorial, there were any professors that had an influence on your career direction.
Yeah, it's a bit like teachers at schools. You know, you've got a good teacher, they put you in a certain direction. You have a bad teacher, and it puts you off that particular subject for life. And then only later in life you realize what you lost. But there were two guys at Memorial. One was the guy I worked with on the glacier, Bob Rogerson. And he was totally disorganized. And he couldn't give a lecture to save his life. And we used to go in the cafeteria, and there'd be a pile of papers, and we'd go, you know, papers are what you write as a scientist. And we just go through the papers. And I found that very stimulating. It's a very freewheeling discussion. And then the other guy was Bob Slatt, an American, who actually ended up going back to Oklahoma. He was working in the oil industry quite a bit. And I learned from him how to write, how to set out arguments as a scientist. So between the two of them, I was really impressed with Memorial. Plus there was this buzz about the place because of the discovery of oil in Hibernia, the whole plate tectonic thing was going on, and also there's such lovely people. And I spent a lot of time in the outports. I found my accent gained me access to places that normally wouldn't. So I got adopted actually by a Newfoundland family, the Brown family in Conception Bay, and I went to all their family dues. One of them was a musician. Ryan's Fancy was a very well-known Newfoundland band at the time, so we went to all their concerts, and I really got to know the island quite well. So I go back regularly. I got a lot of time for the Newfoundlanders. And I saw it when the outports were still vibrant and living, and now you go back there and there's all these abandoned outports. Yeah. So I saw it at a critical stage, just as a cod fishery was beginning to collapse.
Right. Now the next stop on your route was East Anglia University.
Yep.
And your description of that university and its location, you have to share with our audience.
Yeah, it's a second-rate university on a third-rate golf course. Now, I'm going to get criticized forever for having said that, but I went there to work with one guy. And I went to work with...
You were a PhD candidate.
Yeah, I was a PhD candidate, and it's very important to choose who you work with. And so I gravitated to the best guy in my field of glacial geology. And it turned out that he had very little interest in supervising students. And it was the old British attitude, well, disappear and give me a thesis in 3 years, which suited me fine, because I'm self-motivated, and it suited me fine. But I didn't spend... He was close to a genius in terms of geology. Fantastic. And I think I learned probably more from him driving to conferences and just listening to him than I did formally. But one of the problems was he hadn't applied for any money. So I get there, and he was away, and he had this history. He was almost a theoretical professor, if you know what I mean. He was away so much.
Yeah.
So you go in and there'd be notices on the door saying, well, I've gone to Poland, back next week. And the classic one was gone to Antarctica, back in 3 months. and the graduate students, I had the office, well, there was a bunch of us had offices next door, so the dean would poke his head around and say, well, is there any chance of you guys doing a lecture for this guy? Yeah. And that's how I met my future wife, but that's another story. But we ended up working with him in the Arctic, and I'd worked in bear country. I knew what bears could do, and polar bears and all that sort of stuff. So I always had a rifle. And this guy, my supervisor, said, "Oh, you don't need to worry about bears. Just bang a couple of billy lids together." You know what a billy is? It's a cooking pot.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah. I always made sure I had the rifle. And I was working up on a cliff one day, had a great view of the beach, and he was working down here. And I saw this bear, polar bear, swimming around, and it started coming into the beach. So I thought, let's see what happens. Let's see how the billy lid theory works. And anyway, it got too close, and I fired a warning shot, and the bear went back into the water. And I went down, and I said, "Well, how's the billy lid thing going?" I think he needed paper of a certain type at that stage. And then we got back in the rubber boat and circled around the bear, and as we were pulling away from the bear, it just leapt straight out of the water onto an ice floe. And I thought, well, it could have done that at any stage while we were going past in the boat. So that was working with my supervisor.
Now, you mentioned what I see as being a bit of a challenge. You're supposed to spend 3 years writing your thesis, and you're not funded. How do you close that gap?
Well, I became a monk. I completed fieldwork in Iceland. And Iceland in the 70s was a pretty remote area. There's none of the tourist facilities that there are there today, which was very interesting, actually. I was working on the ice caps. I was doing long solo hikes up onto the ice cap, measuring things. And then I went to the French Alps. I worked down there. And at that time, France didn't have any oil. And they were using water for hydro, but the water was coming from glaciers, so it was full of sediment. So what they did, they excavated a whole series of tunnels underneath the glaciers and got the water off before it had time to pick up a lot of sediment. But it gave us access to the ice base. So we spent a lot of time in the dark, like all good scientists, underneath these glaciers and watching them slide and making observations about how they erode, how they transport material and so on. And then I worked in Switzerland, and then I got back to UK. And as I say, I became a monk, and I just rode up, and I got it done in 18 months.
Wow.
Which is, I think, a world record. I can't see anybody beating that, because now there's residence requirements. The university actually requires you to be there for 3 years.
Now, you were giving lectures at that time, and you mentioned a certain student that you met in lectures, and I understand she was planning an expedition to look at glaciers. It's pretty uncommon, isn't it, for two people with PhDs interested in glaciers to get together?
Yes, well, it was this thing that the graduate students were often called upon to give lectures to the undergrads. So I met this student, not in any formal fashion or anything like that. And then it turned out that she was going to Iceland the following year. And there's always this sense in British universities of exploration, expeditions. They have expeditions to northern Canada. You think, well, people are living there. Anyway, she was going up to Iceland the following year, and she came to me and said, well, you work there. What's it like? How do you get gas and all this sort of stuff? So that was the start of our relationship. And it was about a week before I handed my thesis in. So I'd finished. And I'll be honest, I always found girls a bit of a distraction.
Okay.
Anyway, so...
I always found them a bit of an attraction.
Well, that was later. I'd get this thesis written. So I said to her, I've always wanted to hitchhike across the US and Canada. And I was going to leave in 3 weeks' time. Do you want to come with me? And she said, yeah, sure. And that was the start of our relationship, which we married later on, and we've been married now for 42 years. So it all started hitchhiking across the States. And we got what was called a standby flight, where you went to the airport, you simply sat down and you waited till a seat came up. And we flew to San Francisco. It was about $100 or something ridiculous. And we got out of the airport, we got picked up by a whole bunch of interesting people. And they'd usually say, well, you got a weird accent, where you're from? And, you know, you get talking and you find out they'd picked you up because they had long drives and they wanted to talk something. But then they'd say, well, let's go and look at this. Or, you know, and so a simple hitchhike across the US and Canada became a bit of a dog leg. You know, we went to all national parks and all that sort of stuff. And I ended up in Montreal where I had an aunt. She'd been a war bride during the war, came over, married a Canadian soldier, ended up in Montreal, always complained about the winters. And then we got to New York, and we had to get a taxi because it was at night. We didn't really want to hitchhike through New York to the airport. And again, the taxi driver said, oh, have you seen New York before? And we said, no. So we had this huge tour of New York, you know. So it was a great trip. And then we got back to UK. I had a teaching and research job up in Newcastle.
Right.
And that's where she's from. So it was, for her, it was going back to her home territory.
How long were you there?
Just 2 years.
Okay.
Because in the meantime, this Prime Minister called Margaret Thatcher.
Ah, yes, we've heard of her.
Yes, had been elected. And she put Britain on a different course, which in retrospect was the right course, but it was a lot of blood on the floor. As a result, it was a miners' strike. She tried to beat the unions and did. And she wanted to clean up higher education too. She thought there were too many universities, too many small departments. And I could see the writing on the wall. And we had a fantastic time in Newcastle. And I worked there with another one of these people. You can look back and say, yeah, they had a big influence on me. A senior professor, Bill Dearman, and he was into engineering. So, you know, geology, earth science is a big area. You can look at the history of the Earth, you can look at practical applied things like hydrogeology or environmental geology. And he was into engineering geology. Basically, a building's going to continue to stand up if you put them on this particular type of rock or this particular sediment. And I got into that. I got quite interested. And there was a lot of very complex lab work that I had set up. There was a lot of equipment that needed to be set up for the students, and I was this much in front of the students.
Yeah.
So it was a great learning experience, but it was very short, 2 years. And
Now, he, though, played a role in the next step in your life.
yeah, he did actually. He had a colleague here in Toronto. I should say there in Toronto. And there was an advert in the Toronto Star for a supervisory geologist for the Ontario Geological Survey. And they wanted somebody who knew a bit about geology and also engineering. So I thought, right. So I threw my hat in the ring, came over in July, and it was about 35 degrees. And I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And I got the job. And then I had automatic landed immigrant status because it was a government job. And my wife didn't have any status at all. Well, no, she was still my girlfriend. So we decided to get married.
Which got her status.
Yeah, it did, yeah. And at the wedding, somebody stood up and said, well, this is a telegram from Mr. Trudeau, the elder, that those rules no longer applied. That if you got married, then the wife didn't get landed immigrant status. It was a spoof, but anyway, it was funny at the time. So we came across, and she started graduate work at Toronto. She went all the way through to a master's, PhD at Toronto, ended up doing a postdoc at McMaster University. And then at that time, there was a lot of concern in Canadian universities that the professoriate was aging and it needed refreshing. So there was a lot of opportunities for younger, I was young once, faculty to get a permanent job. And she and I both benefited from that. So she ended up, she's a full professor at McMaster, just shortly about to retire. and myself too at Toronto. So we've had parallel careers and we've always worked together. We've got a lot of joint publications and so on.
So you went to the U of T in
It was early 80s.
early 80s?
Yeah.
Did you go to Scarborough campus immediately?
No, I didn't. I taught as an adjunct prof, which is a way in which universities get people to teach for little or nothing. And I really enjoyed it. But I was teaching thereafter downtown. And again, I was teaching in engineering, geoengineering, so you teach geology and then the geotechnical properties of different types of rocks and successions and all that. And at that time, Scarborough was taking off. And I was also teaching Scarborough students who were required to go downtown to finish their degree. So you couldn't do a complete degree at Scarborough, at any of the suburban campuses. It was quite common to do your introductory courses, and then you'd have to go downtown to finish your degree. And I began to notice there was a lot more Scarborough students in my class than there were from the St. George campus. So that's how I ended up at Scarborough.
What was your research interest at the beginning? What did you pick out as your sort of focus?
Well, it was originally modern glaciers, arising from the 1970s climatic cooling. We didn't know enough about how they were going to react. And it's a bit ironic that the day, going back to my PhD, that I handed it in, the climate started warming. So timing is everything.
Yeah.
I think it was all the trees that were cut down to make the paper that went into my thesis, I think. But I began to be interested, well, let me backtrack a bit. If you work on modern glaciers, you're condemned to a life of discomfort. Mm-hmm. It's hard physical work. Your summers, nice Ontario summers are spent up north in the Arctic, freezing, living in a tent, running away from bears and all that sort of stuff. And I got a bit tired of it, I suppose. And so I started looking at the ancient record of ice ages. So we've had ice ages in the last couple of million years. These are the ones that have scoured out all the Great Lake basins, dammed all the big lakes around here. But we've had glaciations going back, 2.4 billion years. And as luck would have it, the rock record of those events is now in the southern continent. So you could go down there and bask in the sun while looking at ancient glacial rocks. So we did that for a long time together. And by that stage, we had a couple of kids, and we dragged them around the world several times on sabbaticals, Brazil, Australia, Italy. And typically, we'd be in the field, or we'd be in the core library. And a core library is something where industry will donate core, so drill core. And it's like a library. And so we'd spend a lot of time. The kids would help us, actually. They'd go and run off and find all the core that we needed. But it was a nice break from having to work on modern glaciers to look up really old glaciers.
You have authored more than 150 research papers, maybe more than that. That's what I found. And the
Did you read them all?
Sorry?
Did you read them all?
I only got up to number 79.
Oh, that's pretty good. That's more than my students.
The two areas in which I could see you writing in the leading scientific journals were Ice Age geology, which I think we've touched on, but also environmental geology. What's that all about?
Well, it's using earth science skills to better manage environmental problems, and usually it's hydrogeology and how groundwater that's moving through pores in the subsurface interact with surface water supplies. And I'm still very much interested in how urban areas affect water quality. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we have winters in Canada, really, but we throw huge volumes of road salt on the roads, and that will About half of it will run off during thaws and get into rivers and creeks, and then the rest of it goes down there. And then it goes into the groundwater flow system, and it's there for hundreds of years. So if we decided to stop using road salt tomorrow, that problem's still there. And there are many areas where springs, which is where groundwater is emerging to the surface, is brackish water. So I became very interested in modeling this. There was a lot of computer work, but also I worked very closely with communities, particularly the city of Pickering. And they've had some real problems there with some of the coastal lagoons. It's still going on. About the impact of road salt. So we were lucky, there was a lot of funding at that time too. So we set up monitoring programs where you put instruments out on rivers, you put them down drill holes, and the state of the art now is that will collect chemical data every second, half second, so you end up with tons of data. But you can see pulses of very salt-rich water going down into the groundwater as a result of sudden thaws in winter. And then those springs will continue to be saline even in the summer. So it's like a gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
And we did a lot of work on that. We looked at the influence of Highway 401. You know, you're driving, well, your tires are wearing down, your brakes are wearing, so there's chemicals released from that. They accumulate on the road surface. And then you get a sudden rainstorm, and then the quality of the water is just terrible. So we measured the impact of 401, measured the impact of urban development, and it's still something that interests me a lot, actually, because it's working with communities. So it's showing the public why knowledge of geology is important, not just in understanding Earth history, but also there's some real-world applied problems.
Direct implications.
Yeah.
One of the other areas that I understand you worked in was ocean drilling.
Yes.
My research indicates that you worked with the International Ocean Drilling Program on board the Resolution.
Yep.
What were you doing?
As little as possible, actually. No, a little.
Cruising.
It was a program that was set up in the late 60s because of this guy, Tuzo. He argued that continents are, in some cases, moving apart. And they were being pushed apart by new ocean floor crust that was being added along the center lines. And if that theory held, then the rocks on the sea floor, on the ocean floor, should get older away from their center lines. So this drilling program was set up in the late 60s. And the Resolution, the drill ship, is Canadian built. It was built in Halifax. So I spent 3 months on it, down in the Antarctic, drilling. I was on the midnight to noon shift because we were working in the labs, and I felt that was a nice quiet time. And we were drilling in, I think it was about 5 kilometers of water typically, and then another 3 or 4 kilometers into the ocean floor. And you collect core, and my job was to describe the core in terms of its physical properties, and then there was like a chain system. It went through all the labs. People looked for fossil material, paleomagnetic characteristics, geochemical characteristics. And at the end of the day...
I'm nodding as if I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know, you're doing pretty good. There's a test later, though. And then at the end of the day, you'd have a record of time of the last 40 million years. So we were able to, at the end of that process, say that there'd been an ice sheet in Antarctica for 38 million years, which was a big finding, actually. But it was getting down there. We left from Punta Arenas, the bottom end of South America. We went out through Cape Horn, and we had a major storm en route. And this is a big boat, but it was tossed around. We had 30-foot waves, and my bunk was right at the bow of the ship. So
Perfect.
it was like being punched.
Yeah.
You could feel the ship stagger. And all this water came up over the boat. But it was okay. And then we spent 3 months down there and ended up going back to Cape Town. And we had a Canadian engineer, and a drill ship is really a a collection of huge tanks. So there's water tanks, there's tanks for concrete because you have to seal up the holes and all this sort of stuff. And there was a bet on board about when we were going to arrive back at Cape Town. So I nurtured my friendship with the chief engineer on board to get any inside information about when we were going to get there. But he was a Canadian, and he had that boat rigged up like a canoe, perfectly weighted. We got back there earlier, and I found out we were going to get back earlier. That's another story. So that was a good trip. But now there's a brand new boat. It's Japanese made. And the problem with the Resolution was it had no means of containing any gas that you would come across. And so it's potentially very dangerous. If you hit high pressure gas, it would blow the whole thing back up through the boat. So this new boat, which I've been on, I haven't worked on, but I've been on in Japan, has a means of containing gas. So it's state-of-the-art drilling. And there's only one boat. So, and just to finish off, it's owned privately, and it's leased out to universities for so many months of the year, but that mission of this Japanese boat is to drill to the mantle, because we don't know what's down there, and there may be mineral wealth, maybe energy sources, but that shows you the scale of our lack of knowledge, that there's only one boat doing it.
Wow, yeah. I want to take a minute, Nick, and talk about some of the books you've written. You've edited books on glacial geology. You've co-edited a book on paleoclimate, co-edited a book on urban geology.
Yeah.
But I think what you're most well known for are what I'm going to call the books that lay people, that speak in a language that laymen can understand. You did a rocks series, the rocks of Toronto, the rocks of Ontario, the rocks of Canada, the rocks of the Canadian Shield. Road Rocks.
Yes.
Was one you did. But you also did a book on Georgian Bay, which we had hoped that we would be able to offer for sale this evening, but it's all sold out.
Till November, I learned this evening, I went to the Georgian Bay bookstore, and I learned it's one of their bestsellers.
Yeah.
Which tells me about the interest in Georgian Bay.
Yeah.
And they're getting it back in November, so that's a plug to the audience.
Yeah.
So if you have any nephews, nieces for Christmas.
There actually is one person in the audience who wanted 15 copies of it, if you'd brought them. So.
The good thing about the book, it's a good read, but all the proceeds go to the Georgian Bay Land Trust, so they're being fed back into conservation of Georgian Bay.
So basically, if I understand that book, you take the reader through a couple of billion years of the history of Georgian Bay. What kinds of things are you trying to discover, reveal, explain?
Well, I think there's a lot of people today think the world was created as you see it now. That's had no history, and I go back to the days at school when I first became aware that the planet has a history. There's many different chapters. This guy Tuzo told us how that story is basically organized, and it's all about what's called supercontinent cycles. Mm-hmm. It's not something you buy in Canadian Tire. It's the fact that continents will aggregate together to form larger land masses called supercontinents. They're very unstable. They tend to break up. So the phase we're in right now is one of continents moving apart. But if you plot out their movement, it's quite easy to do with satellite imagery, you find that they are slowly going towards Southeast Asia. So the next supercontinent will be made in China. Like everything else.
Everything else, yeah.
So that's the basic rhythm of Earth history. And Georgian Bay illustrates at least 3 of those supercontinents. It's one of those unique places on the planet where, in a relatively small area, you can see evidence for 3 supercontinents, and that's how the North American continent has grown. So if you want a window into geologic time, Georgian Bay is one of the best places to come. And so we go through that at the beginning of the book, and then we get into the later phases of geologic history, which is all about ice ages, recent ice ages. So just 10,000 years ago, this place would have been under a kilometer of ice, which was slowly flowing down into the States, grinding away at its base and carving out the Great Lake basins. So that's the origin of all the Great Lakes. And then what we really wanted to do was, again, show the importance of the geology to us. So you then get into the cultural history of Georgian Bay, and I'm still amazed, having worked myself on ice sheets and glaciers, that there were people moving into this area 11,000 years ago, called Paleo-Indians, and they come across from Asia, from Beringia and so on, chasing caribou herds. And this would have been a very hostile environment. So there would have been a big ice sheet slowly retreating. It would have blocked the drainage of the Great Lakes, so all the lakes have much higher ancestors. And this place would have been flooded pretty shortly after the ice got out of here by Glacial Lake Algonquin. So if you got a Pentatang machine, I know I'm in Midland, but I'll mention Pentatang machine. You see all the terraces. And that's the different levels of the lake, which you can appreciate is much higher than the modern lake level. And there are lots of archaeological sites scattered along the shoreline of Glacial Lake Algonquin. And I find that amazing that people were living in this environment. And I have a postdoc student mapping the shoreline using very high resolution mapping techniques. It's called LiDAR, but you use laser beams aimed from a drone or a plane, and you measure the two-way travel time. So the laser beam comes down, hits the ground, goes back up. And you can measure the altitude, and you get an idea of the roughness of the topography on a very, very small scale. And she's been picking out things like iceberg scours. So there were big icebergs in this lake that were grinding in shallow water, being blown in. And there were people living in here at that time. It's incredible. And they were the first mines in Canada, because they were mining chert, or flint, from rocks of the Niagara Escarpment 10,000 years ago. It's incredible.
I want to come back to the subject of Georgian Bay when we talk about the geopark, but I want to take a minute now and just talk about a couple of other stops you've made along the way. One of the things that our audience may not be aware of is that you were a CBC host, that you hosted a geological program, I guess 2009, 2010, and it was part of the Nature of Things.
Yep.
Can you tell us what it was that you were presenting?
There were 2 5-part series we did, and I must mention a gentleman called Michael Alder. He was the executive producer then of the Nature of Things, and they commenced a 5-part series on the geology of Canada, and they kind of got stuck. They didn't really know how to order the series. And I got a call one day from a CBC researcher, do you know anything about salt? So I said, yeah, well, you don't eat too much, it's not good for you. They said, oh, no, we want somebody who knows something about how salt originates, where it's from. We're going to do some filming down at Godrich in the mine. Could you help us out? So I said, yes. And that was the start of it. So I went down there, and I had to go down in the mine hoist, the main elevator, which they bring all the salt up. And they literally shut down production while I did that. I had one shot to talk about the mine on the way down. Anyway, it worked. And then I became an advisor to that first series. And we did a section on the Great Lakes too, actually. We spent a lot of time on Georgian Bay. And then that was well received. And then about 18 months later, I got a call saying, well, do you want to do the same thing for the world? So
It's a small task.
It is. So I had an office down at CBC, I had all these maps up, and it was like bucket list. Like, where do you want to go? So we went to 23 different countries. I think I climbed about 12 volcanoes, and there was this disturbing trend that anywhere I'd been, the volcano would blow up weeks later. And it was the same with earthquakes too, so you've got to be a bit careful actually inviting me anywhere. And that was a great success. Even though I sat it myself, the ratings were really good, and
You won 3 Gemini.
well, we didn't win. We were
Nominated
for 3 Gemini Awards, and I learned an awful lot actually about how to write simply, and we wrote the narrations for David Suzuki, and I actually enjoyed that, being stuck in a studio, and you'd have on multiple screens the video, the music, and you had to fit the narration in, you know.
Yeah.
And it had to be done quite quickly. I really enjoyed that, actually, even though I was stuck in a studio for several months. But that really was a huge influence on my teaching at the university, because I used it in teaching.
Okay.
And I'm retiring in December from teaching. I'm still going to keep doing research, but I have a course with 2,000 students in it.
Wow.
It's a breadth course.
Wow.
So, but it's all because of Planet Earth, the geologic journey.
Yeah.
And I simply take the students on a trip around the world.
Yeah.
And we have a very international group of students. Yeah. And I think they appreciate learning about, you know, where they're from, where their families are from. Yeah. And it's sort of surreptitious teaching of science. They learn the geology. They probably wouldn't have been attracted to geology in the first place. It's just about rocks, right? But because we take them on a journey, they learn how the Earth works and why geology is important. So it was really a game changer for me.
The Geological Association of Canada made this comment about the series, and I think it's worth sharing with our guests. No other single Canadian Earth science outreach effort has ever reached as many people or had as great an impact on the Geological Journey series.
Yeah.
You also, yeah.
We need to do another one.
You also did host something called Running on Empty.
Yes.
What was that? Was also the nature of things.
Yeah, it was. That was about the drought in California.
Yeah.
So we went down there, and it was a real eye-opener. We spent about 3 weeks driving across much of California, and it's a horror story.
And getting worse.
Yeah, there's no good end to it, because I think fundamentally it's about greed and the tragedy of the commons. You have a common resource, but there's no, as a lawyer, you appreciate that, there's no regulations about how you use that resource. So everybody tends to use it and destroy it in the end. And we saw a lot of that where there was uncontrolled pumping of groundwater, and you basically pump until it's gone, and then you deplete the aquifer. The aquifer is where the groundwater is stored, but
Right.
once you take the water out, you can never replenish that because the sediments collapse. So it's like a tire. We have a puncture, but you're never going to inflate it again.
Yeah.
And they're in the middle now of one of these historic mega droughts. And I don't know how it's going to end.
Yeah. It's a tragedy. Before we talk about the geopark,
Yep.
and I know many people here are anxious that we get to that, I just want to ask you probably a more broadly based question, and that is, what's the impact of geology on our society, both as a society and as individuals? What is there that we should be taking from what you do as affecting our lives?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, I'd say broadly educational about Earth history. The Earth does have a history, which I think everybody should at least be aware of. And then today, you know, we're facing this shortfall in critical minerals. We're trying to develop a green economy, But the minerals we need for that are in short supply, either short supply or other actors control their distribution. And I think that's going to put a brake on the green economy, because we're already talking about geological scarcity, and the demand for minerals is some people are now saying exceeds all known reserves. So there's that issue, and it's at a time when I think there's a basic distrust of geology, geologists, because we're portrayed in many circles as sort of being anti-environmentalists. We want to create mines, we want to use oil. People forget that our infrastructure, our way of life is totally, it will be dependent on those for many years to come. So we've got to overcome that resistance and try and get students to get into the profession, because we're going to need a lot of geology in the next 100 years. Because we got to use Tuzo's understanding of plate tectonics and how minerals form in different plate tectonic settings as prospecting tools. And that's at a time when it's difficult to open a mine, it's difficult to prospect, there's all sorts of regulations, environmental controls. And certainly we have not done mining in a very environmentally sustainable fashion up till now. There's lots of horror stories. We've got to do it better, but we're going to have to do it if we're going to survive, if our living standards are going to survive anywhere close to what they are now. So I think there's a huge role for geology. And I see the education side of it as a way of stimulating interest, just the way I got interested at school. I would hope that of the 2,000 students that I teach, maybe one might be go on to become a professional geologist.
Nick, you've won countless awards. I listed them all out here. I won't embarrass you by reading them, but your career has been recognized far and wide with awards of merit from your peers, from educators, from lots of organizations.
Thanks.
So congratulations on that. I do want to move though to the geopark,
Yeah.
and I know that in the somewhat limited time we have remaining. So this is a geopark that will be focused on Georgian Bay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what the goal is? And by the way, it's established by UNESCO. An application has been made, I guess is the best way to put it.
It's a complex process. You have to go through a national committee in Ottawa, and we've gone through that. So we're now an aspiring UNESCO Geopark, and then we're now preparing a long formal proposal to UNESCO in Paris to get the full status. And UNESCO set it up, I think it was 2001, and they quite correctly recognize that the Earth is, 4.5 billion years old, and there are certain places around the planet that illustrate that history, either in terms of landscapes or the rocks, and that there is often a unique cultural response to that landscape. So these are regions, and the term geopark is a bit of a misnomer, actually, because it's not like a national park or provincial park where there's boundaries and there's things you mustn't do. You mustn't take your dog in or something. You've got to pay admission. It's more recognition that an area uniquely records a portion of Earth history. And Georgian Bay is a region. It's a unified region, and the geology is absolutely incredible. As I said, it records three supercontinents. So it's a key area for understanding the history of North America. And then you've got the Ice Age record, you've got the 10,000 years of cultural response, and even European response, the settler response, was very different on the Shield from the rich soils in the south that have been left by the glaciers. So in many ways it's a unique area, a unique ecosystem which is dependent on the geology. And it is an absolute gem of a candidate for a UNESCO Geopark.
How many geoparks are there in the world?
There's about 170. I think there's about 6 being added every year.
And how many in Canada?
There's 5 that have been set up, and I think there's another 8 or 9 in the pipeline.
Okay.
So it's a global network. It's all about education, conservation, and it doesn't prescribe certain activities. It doesn't say you shall not do this. It doesn't inhibit anybody's rights to do exactly what they want. But it does, to my mind, it aids conservation by letting the world know, letting Canada know that Georgian Bay is a really special place. We all know that.
Yeah.
It's a special place. But in terms of geology, it is unique. And I think by having a geopark status, it's going to aid protection. And there's a lot of conservation groups, and I think it's going to help them make the case for protection.
Does it promote research in the
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of the criteria for selection as a geopark. It has to have a history of research. And Tuzo Wilson got a lot of stimulation for his ideas about plate tectonics from the rocks in Georgian Bay. A lot of dating techniques that we accept, we use all the time now, were developed in Georgian Bay. And some of the oldest mines in Canada, I could say 10,000 years old. And the Geological Survey of Canada was set up 1842, I think in Ottawa. And Georgian Bay was one of the first areas that was examined. So it's got a long history of research. Some of the ideas that have come out of the Bay have gone on to influence how geologists think worldwide. And it's also, the other criteria, it has to have potential for further research. And, I think new technology comes along and you begin to answer old questions in different ways. And I mentioned LiDAR, it's like a new way of looking at the Earth's surface. So it's a classic case where you can begin to tease out answers by new generations of students with new technology. So it's enormous potential.
There were a couple of the benefits, if you will, that I'd like to have you expand on, because I wasn't sure how this would play out once it became a park. One of the purposes is described as being to showcase different cultural uses of landscapes in geological settings in the course of human history.
Yeah.
Can you briefly, Nick, give us an example of what that means?
Yeah, Georgian Bay's evolved over the last 10,000 years. So the glaciers go back, and you have early people coming in that lived amongst the glaciers, chasing caribou. And then there's this warm climate phase about 7,000 years ago, 7 to 5,000 years ago, and all the glaciers out west in the Rockies disappear. They all melt. And the level of the Great Lakes goes down. They become isolated from each other. This is really exciting research, and they become slightly brackish because there's insufficient fresh water flowing in and out. And so there are oral traditions of being able to walk across much of Georgian Bay, and at that time we called it Lake Huff, so it's a much lower level. And then about 4,000 years ago, the climate cools, gets wetter, the lake level comes back up throughout the Great Lakes, the glaciers reform out in the Rockies. I was out there just a few weeks ago, and the retreat of glaciers is exposing trees that were growing there during that warm phase, and then were literally overrun by ice much later on. And that's the beginning of agriculture in this area. Maize growing, so you have sedentary First Nation groups growing palisaded villages, so that Champlain would have been well aware of, trading corn for pelts with mobile hunter-gatherers on the shield, and that's the Europeans saw that, thought, well, this looks a good thing. Let's do the fur trade thing,
Yeah.
And then, the Europeans come in, and They tried farming the shield. There were colonization roads built up onto the shield, and there's lots of terrible tales about families that came over. They'd been given land, sight unseen in Ireland and Britain, and they get over here and it's all rocks. And they have a terrible time. They log the trees, that's not sustainable, so then they end up going to Manitoba. Whereas the people that settle down here, you have good farmland, you have the railway coming up, all the ports, immigrants coming in and using the Great Lakes as, you know, a marine highway, the voyageurs, and it's all dependent on landscape. You know, whether you're dealing with the shield or the much richer farmlands to the south. So it's a fantastic area for illustrating the cultural response to changing climate and also changing landscapes.
The other purpose that I want to explore with you is this, to develop ecologically sustainable geotourism for the benefit of local communities. Tell us how that benefits Midland and Anishinaabeg.
Well, we have a steering committee. One of your local people, Jack Conti, is on the committee, and we're enjoying working with him tremendously, learning about the cultures. I've certainly had my eyes open listening to Jack. Tony Piggott, too, is our chair, so there's a steering committee. And we have a relationship with the Midland Cultural Centre. They are our partners. And it's quite possible that we would have a public interpretation centre here in Midland. And it would generate what I call value-added tourism. So it's not people that just want to drive to Osaga Beach. They would learn about the park. A lot of it will be online. We've already developed a website. There's a lot of educational material. So if you're in Germany or South Africa, Australia, you can learn about the importance of Georgian Bay. It's global recognition of the importance of this place. And it would attract tourists that want to know more about the ecology, the culture, so there's opportunities for cultural tourism. I know some First Nation groups are trying to develop that. And there's wellness, there's culinary experiences, so it's the whole thing. It's the total Georgian Bay experience that is part of the geopark.
This would be the largest geopark in Canada?
Yeah, it's about 15,000 square kilometers.
Can you describe for us what the unique landscapes are? I've seen you write about certain areas of the bay, and I think a lot of us here feel like we know Georgian Bay pretty well, but can you tell us what we would identify as significant landscapes?
Yeah, I think there are three, really. There's the limestone plains, you know, the Bruce and other areas in the south, which I think had soils and thick forests before Europeans came in and cleared all the trees. A lot of soil just blew away, I think, or burnt. And they're a unique habitat. You know, they have the same in southern Sweden. They call them alvars, but these beautiful limestone plains. And then you've got the classic shield. You know, pine trees growing out of the rock, lakes, 30,000 islands, all these ice-scoured islands with these beautiful banded gneisses that tell us about these continental collisions billions of years ago. And then you've got the south, where you've got thick glacial sediments, you've got farms, totally different landscape. So they're the three basic building blocks around the bay, and they'll reflect different geology. Excuse me.
How is this project funded?
It's a not-for-profit. If you want to make donations, I'll get that in right now. Thank you for the we have a website, and we're looking for donors. It's all going to be community-driven. And we hope that in terms of public interpretation center, you know, staffing and so on, there'll be some support, strong support from the community.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe you could just, we'll finish our conversation about this area by asking you who is heading the research side of things. I think it's one of your graduates.
Yes, I have a postdoctoral fellow, so that's somebody who's done a PhD and still working in the university. She and I we worked in the Congo together for 2 summers, and Death Valley and all over the place. So she's heading up.
And who is she?
Kirsten Kennedy, and she is partially funded by the Midland Cultural Centre. So we're very proud of that emerging relationship we have with the centre. Fantastic place. And she's using LiDAR. We have this enormous great drone, and she is documenting the landscapes that we were just talking about. And lately we've made the connection with an archaeologist, Peter Stork. Some of you may know about Peter. He used to work at the ROM. He wrote a fantastic book called Back to the Ice Age about the Paleo-Indians that lived in this area 10,000 years ago. And he tries to put his mind in their minds. Fantastic book, Back to the Ice Age. And we're finding now that using LiDAR, you can get much more out of the archaeological sites because you can read the landscape. Kirsten has just completed a number of surveys around the bay. There was one that sticks in my mind of what they call the Red Wing site. And it was on the shore of glacial Lake Algonquin. And it was where they were mining chert. And the edge of the escarpment had been tilted down as a result of very cold winters. The ground becomes frozen, it weakens the rocks when it thaws, and the edge of the escarpment is what we call cambering. And in the process, you open up cracks. So the fissure caves at Collingwood are exactly the same. But the first mines were in these fissures, which I found to be absolutely fascinating, because they would have been openings like shafts, which were naturally formed. You wouldn't have to dig. There's the rocks. There's the chert. So to me, that's a great illustration of how new technology can illustrate ancient environments. In this case, human environments.
Nick, one of the things we do with this program is to ask our potential audience to submit questions. So when we announce this program, we invite people who might have an interest in the subject, and we have received more questions for you than any other program that we've had.
I hope they're easy ones.
Well, they're going to have to be brief ones because we're almost out of time. So here's the first one, and it has to do with climate change.
Yeah.
What are modern geology's most current thoughts on climate change and the increasing constraints we are placing on the Canadian oil and gas industries?
Did you say a brief question?
Well, the question's brief. It's up to you whether the answer is.
Oh, climate change. Well, my own opinion is we don't know enough about natural climate variation. And we don't really know enough about the relative importance of human influences on climate. And I know a lot of the people that are working in that field, and they say, okay, so on a scale of 1 to 100, what's the percentage that we are contributing to climate change? And they'll all give you a different answer. So that tells me there's a lot of research to be done. And again, looking in a rear-view mirror of how climate has changed in the last 10,000 years, I think will give us a lot of information about these natural variations. The oil and gas industry, I'll put myself out on a limb. I hope nobody cuts me off, but we're going to need it because the renewables just don't do it for us at the moment. They might in several decades when all the infrastructure, when all the minerals have been found that we need for that economy, but they're not doing it right now.
There's a book called How the World Works that I'm sure you're familiar with, written by a professor from Manitoba, which makes the case, and I have to say it's not a case I wanted to have made to me, but makes the case that we are irrevocably tied to the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, we are.
That there is no possibility of our cutting ourselves off in the near, in the near.
Yeah, I agree with that. We are, you just look around our society and what powers it. Big time power. Winter, mining, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, everything, you know. We have this saying in geology, if it's not grown, it's mined. And we're still in the Stone Age.
Yeah.
We still need to know more about the earth and where minerals are.
Next question.
That'll be a short one.
Given the long history of tectonic processes,
Yeah.
what would you think might be the next truly significant tectonic event affecting Ontario?
Well, it could be an earthquake. There could be an earthquake because there's a lot of research. There's a lot of old buildings in Toronto, and there's now renewed appreciation that we do have earthquakes in Ontario. We just haven't seen the evidence for it. And it's simply because the plate's on the move, right? But you're not in the same, that chair's not in the same place tomorrow.
Yeah,
You know, will have moved.
that's a point, I'll just tell our audience, that's a point that really, that you make very well in this Tuzo book, that basically the world, we're all moving. And when you go home after the show tonight, your house will not be where it was before in terms of its location on the face of the earth. It may be the same place on the street.
It's not because you haven't been drinking or anything.
Yeah,
You know, it's moved. So you can't stand still on planet Earth. It's physically impossible. But we do know that because of that movement, the old structures that you see on the shield become reactivated. They're like brakes. And that's the current model for earthquakes in the middle of plates. Normally earthquakes occur around the margins where they're interacting with other plates, but there is this model. In Ottawa, there's more earthquakes in Ottawa than there are on the West Coast.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's the rock and roll capital of Canada. So there could be an earthquake.
They wouldn't notice in Ottawa.
I think more the big tectonic thing might be climate. I think we had this little cool phase a few hundred years ago called the Little Ice Age. And that was triggered by several volcanoes going up around the Pacific.
Well, that actually is the next question. Scientists expect another ice age in 3,000 to 5,000 years. Will this simply wipe out everything of our civilization, or will we try to find ways to fight it off? Can we be successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it all goes back to whether what we're doing to the climate is sufficient to override these background controls that are going on all the time. And ice ages are driven by what we call astronomical variables. So it's how the Earth goes around the sun. There's wobble of the axis, and the axis changes. And that was first determined by this guy called Milankovitch. Around 1900, there is an astronomical control on long-term climate. And you know, it's a subject for a lot of research, whether what we're doing to climate is sufficient to override that. I've got no view either way. But I think it's more short-term volcanic activity. There's a new appreciation. People are going up and drilling through the Greenland ice cap, going through the Antarctic ice cap, the long ice cores. And you can look at the chemistry of the air trapped in bubbles. You get some idea of global temperatures. And now they begin to find that ash layers, volcanic ash layers preserved in the ice cores, and they precede cooling events. So this again, you know, this thing about, well, we're facing an ever-warming Earth. Well, there could be some surprises in front of us. And if I was a betting man, I think that's what you'd put your money on. Some abrupt climate cooling.
This is a question that interested me. The Canadian Shield appears to end about halfway down Bosley Island. Do geologists know what force or process caused it to stop there as opposed to somewhere else?
It didn't stop. It disappears.
You
The
mean
Canadian, it goes underneath.
Ah.
So if you go down to the Grand Canyon You walk down to the river. Yeah, about halfway down, you go through all the nicely bedded rocks with fossils in, and then you see the Canadian Shield, the same stuff. And it's just buried by much younger sediments, rocks, that record seas that lapped across the shield. So it doesn't disappear. So if you put a borehole down in Toronto, it's about 500 meters down. You can hit the Canadian Shield. And then if you go down Oklahoma, it's as much as 10 kilometers.
Wow.
And you see it in the Grand Canyon, and it goes all the way down to Mexico.
Fascinating.
So we're going to go down and get it back and reclaim it.
Yeah, good luck. Yeah. Nick, we are just about out of time, but I know this is a hard question to answer briefly, but can you tell me what's the future hold for you? What are you looking ahead to? I know you've said you're retiring in 6 weeks from your teaching duties, but you're going to continue to research.
Yeah, well, I appreciate a career in research, being able to work with young people, and I find that you never know who's going to walk in the door. You never know what you're going to be working on from one year to another. So I expect the unexpected, if I can say that. And also I think I've got another book or two to write. So, but it is that doing research, you like following streets, and some just end in dead ends, and others turn out to be in a totally different direction, but very productive. So it's the uncertainty that is the certainty, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to our audiences for a moment and extend some thanks. I want to thank the folks from Rogers who videotape these programs and play them back on Rogers Community Television. And the program's also available on YouTube and on the Midland Cultural Center's website. I want to thank the MCC staff, Glenn Irwin, who is our AV guy, who's always helpful to us, and Michelle Fair and Dan Broom for their support of the program. I want to thank our season sponsors again, Kathy Bales and Michelle Dishaw and Jeff Holloway of RBC Dominion Securities. Our show sponsors, A&A Service and Marine Contracting and Rematch Georgian Bay. Thanks again to Anne-Marie and Armin. I want to thank our little team that does some of the oversight of this program. John Farragher, Brian McHale, Lorianne Clancy, Jen Parker, Doris Sloan, Jonathan Wallace. Many of them are here this evening, and I thank them for their support. Nick, I want to thank you. I have learned a lot from this, as I do whether I'm interviewing an opera singer or an author, but this is an area that I knew very little about, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you.
That's great.
And
Thank you. Thank you.
Found the topic quite fascinating. I will thank those of you who are in our audience here for coming. We appreciate your continuing support. Thanks to our television audience. Those of you in the audience here, Nick and I will meet you in the atrium when the program's over. If you have any questions for Nick, or you want your picture taken with a rock star.
Who's he?
Our next program is October 25th. My guest will be Ileana Grimm, who is a very funny pop artist, and that is going to be a great evening. So hope you can join us again on October 25th. Until then, we'll see you next time. Thanks very much.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Call the Rogers TV viewer response line, email us, or connect with us on social media.
watching hockey just got a power play with NHL Center Ice and Super Sports Pack. With up to 37 out-of-market NHL games a week, you'll always catch your favorite team no matter where you live. Whether it's big matchups you're looking for or following your top fantasy picks, it's all here. NHL Center Ice, part of the Rogers Super Sports Pack. All this for only $35.95 a month. Order through your remote